So Pitt does get the victory. Pitt takes care of business, a 54-29 victory over Duke on the road. Brisk day out there. Kenny Pickett still allowed his flow to be showed off there as he doused water over himself. I'm not sure how that felt good in the cold. Pitt took a while to get going, but eventually a win nonetheless. The Panthers pick up their 7th win of the year and get the win over Duke. This is the Pitt Postgame Show here, of course, brought to you by Pittsburgh Sports Now and on Pittsburgh Sports Live. I'm your host, Mike Asti, supposed to be joined by Paul Zeiss of 93.7 The Fan and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He actually has something come up, so cannot join me. So I am going to rely on you guys to chat along. So if you do have any questions, comments, feel free to put them there in the chat. I will talk to you. We'll do a quick one here to just get something up here for this Pitt Postgame Show, as Pitt kind of made quick work eventually of Duke, but it took a while. So does that pose concern for you moving forward? Pitt's still in the driver's seat for the Coastal and the conference. Certainly not impressive in that first half, though. Duke actually, at one point in the driver's seat of the game, if it was not for a fumble on the opening drive, Duke actually would have had a significant lead early on in the game. They would have jumped out in front right away. They were able to have a situation later in the game with some miscues by Pitt, some mistakes by Pitt. They were right in there, if not being up in front. Pitt eventually then was able to crawl back, mount a lead, get an 11-point lead, I believe, at halftime, mostly off field goals, though. They couldn't get themselves in the end zone. Kenny Pickett with a touchdown pass in that first half, but not able to nearly dominate that he eventually ended up doing. And it did feel like one of those games that Pitt just needed a while to get going, that once Pitt got going, they would eventually get a big victory. They eventually would cover this spread over the lowly Duke Blue Devils. However, okay, after the loss to Miami, after what we've seen from Pitt this year, which is a great season by Pitt standards for sure, and above maybe some expectations entering this year. And at one point, I didn't think it really made sense because of the loss to Western Michigan, but there were people talking about the college football playoff, despite all that logjam. There was an outside shot that if things broke right, Pitt could get in there if they ran the table the rest of the way. Pitt did not. They got tripped up by the Hurricanes. They have that bad loss early year to Western Michigan, who has since just been worse and worse, making that look worse and worse for Pitt. But it was because of Pitt's defense. Pitt's defense hadn't been performing up to snuff this season comparison to the offense. Certainly they didn't play well against Miami. They obviously are the reason why Pitt lost to Western Michigan, and they kind of started off this game sluggish. Duke, though, killed themselves. So this game felt like a game that Pitt had to dominate. They got a big win. They eventually looked good. Pickett looked good enough that he was able to be pulled towards the end of this game. Individually, he certainly was fine, even had a 22-yard run into the end zone, which we haven't seen from Pickett as much this year as maybe in past seasons. Certainly feels and looks totally healthy from what he was last year, the ankle injury causing him to not be able to do that as much at the end of last season. But this is a Duke team that just isn't good, and they have their issues. They have their warts. Entering this game, many who cover Pitt, many who were looking at this game, myself here, because I was going to do this post-game show, you do the research and you see, oh my God, this is a really favorable matchup for Pitt. This is awful for Duke, despite being at home. They didn't have a crowd there. The weather sucked. Maybe it's hard to pick yourself up if you're the Panthers, but Duke's pass defense, not up to snuff. Duke's pass defense flat out bad, allowing all the yards that can be throughout this season. It seemed like a team that Kenny Pickett would pick apart. Okay. And not to say he didn't, but again, it took a while for this Pitt offense to get going and eventually for Pitt to dominate this game, as Kenny Pickett did finish 28 for 44, 416, 3 touchdowns, no picks still. He was sacked 3 times. The offensive line may be a little weaker in this game, but of course, maybe they didn't pick themselves up for it either in comparison to earlier this year. A quarterback rating of 165.6. Unbelievable. His quarterback ratings are just ridiculous this year. So again, Mike Asti here joining you, Pitt Postgame Show. Pitt does get the win 54-29 over Duke. It did take a while, but Pitt eventually able to pull through and able to continue to pull away and get that 7th win of the season So I do see some of you here with me. Feel free to chat along. I want to get your thoughts. If this was a concerning win for Pitt, even with the score the way it was, even with Pitt's victory, Pitt does have North Carolina coming up. Does this win concern you that Pitt started so sluggish, that Pitt's defense sucked against Miami, and then early on in this game bended and almost broke if it wasn't for Duke's issues? This feels like Duke was just as bad as Pitt was good in this game. Does this still give you pause? Because North Carolina also a team that absolutely can score, and actually on this same day knocks off Wake Forest. An undefeated Wake Forest team loses for the first time this year against North Carolina that has a quarterback that can compete, that people pointed to prior to this year would be an issue for Pitt potentially in that quarterback matchup. That's one of those that's left on the schedule for the Panthers. And North Carolina 58-55 over Wake. I feel like that's the game I wish I was watching on this day instead of watching Pitt and Duke in the cold weather out there and watching those Bojangles commercials tease me. Still would have got some of those in that game between Wake and North Carolina, but North Carolina ends up with the win over Wake. So Wake now does have a loss. Definitely changes things a little bit in terms of player of the year, in terms of if Wake has that locked up to appear in the ACC title game that many thought. North Carolina, of course, has 4 losses. They haven't been as good as maybe some would have thought this year entering the season. Started off the year slow, but they certainly showed they can score. And we've seen Pitt have a problem, including that Western Michigan loss early in the season, even when Pitt was riding high and dominating other teams, including having that win on the road against Tennessee the week earlier. That if Pitt's facing a team that also can hang points, if Pitt's facing a team that can score with them, if Pitt's facing a team that, would pose an issue in terms of their offense, tough to deal with for Pitt's defense, then absolutely could be a problem and could be an issue for Pitt in this game. It does kind of feel like a vulnerable matchup for the Panthers. So does North Carolina worry you as an opponent based on what we just saw and based on what UNC did to Wake Forest, handing Wake Forest their first loss of the year, based on what we see here and knowing they can score and knowing that Pitt can score, but knowing Pitt also has their defensive warts? So again, Pitt got the win. Pitt did what they had to do, but impressive? No. But you're going to have games like this, and it's very possible, they were talking about it at halftime, that it might be hard to get up for a game like this. You do have a situation with Pitt, having to go to Durham, having to be on the road in a cold place to play, not a rockin' college football atmosphere like when they were on the road against Tennessee. You certainly could see why maybe, just maybe, Pitt would look at the game and be like, do we really care about this game? Not that that would be any excuse, because, of course, if Pitt would have lost this game, it would have been inexcusable, even though it's to maybe, again, it's maybe to a team. I know that the defensively and how they've been this year, there would have been no excuse. I wasn't trying to put lipstick on the pig there. I was just trying to say be better than Western Michigan because it's MAC versus ACC, but still, it would have been a bad loss. Absolutely, especially after the loss to Miami last week here. I'm going to be with you a little bit longer. If I do see any questions here in the chat, obviously mostly just Pitt got the job done. Pitt was able to finish things up, and kind of happy that Pitt did take care of business. I do see some of you here still watching. Pitt, of course, here, if you're just tuning in, if you're living under a rock today, or if you're living your life because maybe you thought this was a de facto bye week for the Pitt Panthers, Pitt does get the win 54-29. Started slow, a 2-point game early on, a turnover, almost punching it into the end zone by Duke on that first drive, stopped the Blue Devils from taking a touchdown lead to open up the game. Kenny Pickett, 3 TDs through the air, over 400 yards passing, but not as much in the first half, of course. Had to turn it on in the second. Pitt set up for field goals late in that first half. Is that concerning against North Carolina defense that is just awful against the pass? They did clamp down a little bit in that first half as well, and it feels like if Duke could have avoided a couple of turnovers, if they could have played smarter football, they would have been right in this game, and it would have been much closer at halftime. And that also feels like a situation that North Carolina won't have happened to them. So speaking of North Carolina, they get a big win over Duke. That is the next matchup for Pitt. That certainly will not be an easy game. Pitt does have some games that certainly could still trip them up left on this schedule, as Pitt, we thought heading into the Miami game, would be favored in every game through now the rest of the season. Certainly still to be the case here. You still imagine Pitt's going to be favored against a North Carolina team that now only has 5 wins on the year, even after beating Wake Forest. But beating Wake Forest is certainly a big deal. And then Virginia and Syracuse. Syracuse has hung tough with everybody. They played teams tough. I know Mike Vukovkin and I talked about last week, the death taxes and Pitt beating Syracuse, even on the road. They usually take care of business and get it done against the Orangemen. But they were hung tough with Clemson earlier in the year. They've been hanging tough with teams, even though they're certainly still kind of Syracuse. Virginia, also a team with a legit quarterback that could give the Panthers fit. Syracuse, a 5-4 team entering the day. And of course, Virginia, a team at 6-3 entering this Saturday here in the fall. So again, Pitt does get the win, but an impressive win, I can't say that. A win to brag about, I can't say that. A win you'd expect the score to be the way it is, but expected maybe more domination early. A game that, if it went the way it did in that first half, would have been a major problem and a major upset against Pitt. It would have potentially been one of those year ruiners, or people would have been back at Narduzzi. Kenny Pickett's been fine. He was even fine in the losses this year. Solid against Miami, 6 TDs, tying a program record against Western Michigan despite the loss. And of course, knocking on the door right now at Alex Van Pelt's career record, already surpassing Marino for touchdowns, yards, etc. So obviously his Pitt legacy is secured. Who knows about his NFL future? First round pick for many. And I know many of you also want to be taken by the Steelers. I doubt that happens, but we will see. Maybe it's even best for him to get out of Pittsburgh, because certainly not everyone loved him up until maybe this and last year, but now finally has some horses around him. And Pitt's defense has played well at times, but certainly needs to be better than it was against Miami. It needs to be way better than it was against Western Michigan, even though it improved since then for a while prior to the Miami game. And again, Duke is nothing to brag about. So Duke is a team that you kind of expected to be bad, to lose this game, to lose the game the way they did, but did not expect them to hang with it in the first half, did not expect them to potentially have a chance at winning this game the way that first half shook out, if they would have prevented some field goals and maybe would have derailed some turnovers. That'll do it for this edition of the post-game show. Pitt does have that matchup against North Carolina, who is going to be riding high as they are coming off of a 3-point win over North Carolina, or over Wake Forest. Pitt will try to get a win over North Carolina, but certainly won't be easy. Pitt again, a 54-29 winner over Duke. They take on North Carolina in their next game, looking for the eighth win of the season, which is still a solid number for Narduzzi. I don't know if anyone thought that entering this season, or maybe that was around the situation. They then could certainly have a chance to get above that. But North Carolina beats Wake. They gave Wake that first loss. Certainly means they can beat Pitt. Certainly means they can score 58 points on the board against Wake. That's not been Wake games this year. Certainly could be a problem for Pitt, because that is a team that can hang with them quarterback-wise, can hang with them offensively, and certainly could be a problem for Pitt's defense. We will see, though. Again, Pitt wins at 54-29. That'll do it for this edition of the Pitt Postgame Show here on Pittsburgh Sports Live. Subscribe, bottom of that video. That'll help us keep getting this content to you. It is free to do so, thanks to our sponsors throughout the network. So do that, and you'll get a notification whenever anything is released here on the channel. Also, you can find Pat Narduzzi, Kenny Pickett, etc. Post-game reaction, video reaction here on Pittsburgh Sports Live. The game recap, video reaction also over there on Pittsburgh Sports Now. And also stay tuned the rest of today, as I will have another post-game show here on another College Football Saturday here on Pittsburgh Sports Live.